This chart is going viral. It claims that more journalists were killed in Gaza last year than in World War II. Now, when I expose what they're basing this claim on, you're going to realize that this is one of the most dishonest infographics ever. So it's from this report by the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown's University. So it's from an Ivy League uni, and it claims that more journalists have died in 1 year in Gaza than in the combined total of all of these wars. The American Civil War, World War I and World War II, the Korean, Vietnamese and Cambodian wars, the Yugoslav War, the Afghanistan War, and in Ukraine. That's an awful lot of wars. But is the claim even true? Of course not. The source that they use for this data would fail a high school project. For instance, the World War II deaths come from the Freedom Forum's Journalist Memorial. They record the names of 67 journalists who died in World War II. They're not making the claim that only 67 journalists died. Only an idiot would make such a claim. Literally millions of people were killed. But along comes our Ivy League university and they released the paper saying that just 67 journalists died in World War II. This is insane. It's even more insane when you factor in that in pre-war Europe, there were tens of thousands of Jews working in the media. Poland alone had over 130 Jewish newspapers and journals. So I took their 67 names and looked to see how many of them were Jewish. And you know what I found? 2. They're making the claim that during the Holocaust, only 2 journalists who were killed were Jewish. 6 million dead, but only 2 of them are journalists. It's insane. But the insanity doesn't stop there. The report doesn't just undercount journalists from other wars, it massively overcounts the journalists in Gaza. Seriously, if you saw the actual data, you'd think that they were counting every single Gazan with an Instagram account. And I'm not joking, I literally found a construction worker listed as a journalist in the report's source material. And if only this were the worst of it, buckle up as it gets really bad. You see, not only are their numbers inflated with random civilians, but many of their so-called journalists have been confirmed as terror operatives. And I'm going to prove it to you. Here are just a few of their so-called journalists. Remember this guy, Abdullah al-Jamal? Well, he wrote for Al Jazeera and he's included in the report. But he was also a Hamas operative, and when the IDF raided his house, they found 3 Israeli hostages inside. So let me get this straight. They won't count a Jewish journalist who perished in the Holocaust in their data, but they will count a Hamas operative who literally kidnapped Israeli civilians? But let's continue as it gets worse. This is Khaled Riyad Hamad. By day, he's a cameraman. By night, a Hamas terrorist. Or how about Mohammed Washar, a prominent Al Jazeera journalist? Here he is shooting an interview for them. And here he is shooting an RPG. Now, if you thought he was bad, wait until you see the next guy, as he's possibly the most outrageous of all. Meet Akil Hussein Saleh. The media lists him as a journalist, but the Al-Aqsa Mardas Brigade lists him as their field commander. And these are just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many confirmed terrorists masquerading as journalists. The links between Gazan journalists and groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad have now been extensively documented. For example, Eitan Fishberger exposed how a huge number of Gazan journalists were either trained or provided training for Hamas at their media training center, including prominent journalists like Reuters' Fadi Shana and the AP's Adel Hana. But if you think that's bad, wait until you meet this next teacher. The man who's giving this class is Musab al-Barim. He looks pretty innocuous, right? Wrong. He's the literal spokesman for Palestinian Islamic Jihad. In truth, there are very few journalists in Gaza who aren't controlled by Hamas. And all of this is left out of the report. What they basically want you to believe is that Jewish journalists murdered in the Holocaust aren't journalists, but Hamas operatives are. So this guy here, He isn't one. But this guy, he is. That's it. That's their take. We've got to a point in history where the West is now so morally bankrupt that our Ivy League universities and the mainstream media will just regurgitate Hamas propaganda, word for word.